Hello and welcome to this specially designed instruction within a multi-tier system of support webinar. Whether you're joining us live or you're watching a recording of this, we hope to accomplish two objectives over the course of the next hour or so. First, we want to address readiness and how a district or charter school who is currently in the process of implementing MTSS can use existing data sources to make an informed decision about their current capacity for implementing this professional learning. The cross-disciplinary team who has worked on the development of this professional learning feels strongly that there are critical components of MTSS that should be well established to provide the enabling context that will be an integral factor to the success of your implementation. In simpler terms, we can't implement specially designed instruction within a multi-tiered system of support if we don't already have a healthy and well-aligned system to implement it within. Second, we also want to provide some additional detail and specificity about the requirements of a partnership agreement. These requirements are intended to ensure the fidelity of implementation as this professional learning is scaled across the state. In addition to these requirements or responsibilities, we will also share features of the implementation that will allow your district or school for flexibility and alignment to your local context and capacity. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll proceed to some useful resources that you may want to access over the course of this webinar. You can see here links to 3 resources that will be helpful as we progress through the webinar. The first is a link to a previous webinar that outlined the major content areas of this professional learning. The content of this professional learning was derived from an evidence base and a theory of action with an ultimate outcome aligned to accelerating learning for students with disabilities and accelerating that learning through the design and delivery of specially designed instruction within a multi-tier system of supports. To be clear, this professional learning is designed to support teachers in their classrooms as they engage in effective practices to meet the needs of all students. With that in mind, multiple researchers and professional organizations have highlighted the role of effective collaboration between general and special educators in producing improved outcomes. Recently, the Council for Exceptional Children and the Cedar Center collaborated on the identification of high-leverage practices. Drawing on the research of Deborah Ball and her colleagues, high-leverage practices are those that have proven effectiveness across content areas, grade spans, and abilities or disabilities. Not surprisingly, a domain of these practices centers around effective collaboration. We mention this because this professional learning is not just another training for special education teachers. As you will see, to provide this professional learning as intended, it's going to require organized and intentional collaboration across state, regional, district, and school staff, and across both special and general education. It has become clear that we will not produce better outcomes for some of our most vulnerable learners, for our students with disabilities, by creating isolated classrooms and practices. We know that the majority of students with disabilities spend the majority of their time in general education settings. We know that all students do well when students with disabilities do well. And we know that we will have to collaborate to improve our practices. The second link on this slide is to the memo that announced this webinar. We've included the link here for your convenience as a point of reference, and because it has some basic information about who should be engaged with this webinar and in the process of readiness determination. To make an informed decision about readiness, you will need a team of individuals with a wide range of knowledge concerning the implementation of MTSS in your district or school. And we will go into deeper detail on this in just a moment. And finally, the last link is to the partnership agreement that will be required for participation in this professional learning. We will go over this partnership agreement in depth, and this document also contains some key readiness considerations that should be contemplated by your team. And just to note, as we work through this, we trust that districts and schools have a much better point of view concerning their local context, their local readiness, and thus they'd be in a much better position to make an informed decision. As a result, all of the readiness considerations in the partnership agreement are just that. They're considerations. The final decision about participation in this professional learning remains your team's decision. So, are you ready? Some of us likely felt ready months or years ago to begin this work, but some of us likely have some significant reservations and questions that remain. How do we resolve that tension and come to the right decision? Over the course of this webinar, we will provide the basic components for understanding readiness and how we can use existing data sources to make an informed decision about what our current status is for each of those components. What we know about readiness is it is worth assessing. It has a substantial impact on our implementation, and carefully and intentionally ensuring readiness, while it's a big time investment on the front end, it's going to yield substantial dividends down the implementation pathway. To begin, we can all acknowledge that change is difficult. Navigating the change process sometimes feels like a risky proposition, but we do know that there are several steps we can take in order to make change less difficult. The following brief movie describes the change process as a simple analogy of an elephant and a rider. We want to share this movie and then demonstrate how this professional learning has been intentionally designed along these steps.
Psychologists know that there are two systems in our brains, the rational system and the emotional system. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at NYU, came up with a great analogy for these two systems. He said, think of your brain as a human rider atop an elephant. The rider represents the rational system. That's the part of us that plans and problem solves. The rider might do some analyzing and decide, hey, I want to go that way. But it's the elephant, representing the emotional system, that provides the power for the journey. The rider can try to lead the elephant or drag the elephant, but if these two ever disagree, who would you bet on? The elephant has a 6-ton weight advantage, and it's exactly that power imbalance that makes adopting new behaviors very hard. If you want this duo to head a new direction, you also need to think about the path, which represents the external environment. This duo is more likely to complete a journey if you can shorten the distance and remove any obstacles in their way. So bottom line, if you want to lead change, you've got to do 3 things. Give direction to the rider, knowledge of how to get to the destination. You've got to motivate the elephant, which means tapping into emotion. And finally, you need to shape the path to allow for easy progress. That's how change happens.
So based on what we just learned, we know that a clearly marked path ahead of us minimizes anxiety, and it makes us more willing to engage in the change process. So in order to pave this path, we want to share the responsibilities of the partnership agreement. You can see in this partnership agreement that we are working with some of the teaming structures that you have already developed in your district or school to implement, scale, and sustain MTSS. Given that the intent of this professional learning is to support effective specially designed instruction within this MTSS framework, the roles of these teams will really support and facilitate implementation. So as delineated in these responsibilities, you see that first, the district MTSS team is tasked with a general knowledge, understanding, and awareness of the work, making important decisions about implementation, and removing barriers as they emerge. So specifically, this team is charged with selecting the professional learning team. That professional learning team will be the one that is tasked with the actual provision of the training and coaching within the district or school. And in just a moment, we'll provide selection criteria that the district MTSS team can use to select the members of that professional learning team. In addition to the selection of that team, the district MTSS team must also engage in regular communication with that team. There are a number of communication pathways to establish those feedback loops, and they can range from a variety of types of things, from regularly scheduled meetings to ongoing email communication or phone calls or virtual meetings, to leveraging any existing meeting structures within the district or school that can be used specifically to communicate about this particular work. Next, we're going to look at the responsibilities of the professional learning team. And what they will need to do in order to become proficient with the professional learning and redeliver it and support it within the district with a high degree of fidelity. So those responsibilities include the attendance at all 5 of the regional face-to-face sessions with DPI staff, to complete any of the preparation that is provided to them to fully engage within each of the modules, to develop a local plan for redelivery. That we have a timeline for that, but we also have some flexibility built into it that we'll describe in just a moment. To select the initial schools for implementation of this professional learning based on some readiness considerations. To deliver the communication packages that comprise Module 1, to do those during principal meetings or other district leadership meetings. To redeliver the professional learning and to implement this work within the selected schools, to provide the job-embedded follow-up, the coaching that we know is necessary for the transfer of the training skills and behaviors from the training room or the virtual environment into the classroom, to submit any evaluation data via Canvas, so that will likely include things like pre-post assessments of the content, any classroom fidelity checks, and finally to establish and maintain the feedback loops with the district MTSS team that we just described. As you make a determination about the readiness of your district or school to support a professional learning team, the selection criteria are a good place to start. I'll give you a moment to take down this link that will provide you access to the selection criteria. As you can see in this document, there are a number of selection criteria to consider. Selection criteria are important because they help potential team members to understand the work and ensure that it's a good fit for them. These criteria also provide the leadership team opportunity to select for specific characteristics or skills, particularly those that may be challenging to support through training and coaching. For example, in a moment, we'll be talking about motivation and the beliefs that foster motivation for this work. It will be important that the professional learning team shares these beliefs. As you can see, the selection criteria include the following. The first is that the team should consist of 3 to 5 individuals who have clearly defined roles and time that's allocated to the fulfillment of the responsibilities that we just described in the partnership agreement. Collectively, it's important that these individuals have background knowledge and experience related to the implementation of a multi-tiered system of support, effective collaboration, principles of effective coaching, instructional design and delivery that meet the unique needs of a student with a disability, diagnostic assessment and progress monitoring, and the development of effective individualized education programs. So you can see there is a wide range of background knowledge and experience that's going to be required of the individuals who serve on the professional learning team, and knowledge that spans implementation, general, and special education. But based on those requisite knowledge and skills, there are some potential roles that you could consider. These roles are not required, and this is not an exhaustive list. It's just people and individuals who tend to serve in these roles frequently have some of the skill set that are described above. But just to keep in mind that the background knowledge, experiences, and skill sets described above are really the defining factors in what should be selected upon. But the roles may include special education teachers across disability areas, PBIS behavior support or liaison, related service providers, so occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech language pathologists, school psychologists, instructional facilitators and coaches, program compliance specialists, and then also curriculum specialists. Some folks that you may want to look into are if you have individuals that have engaged or instructors with reading research to classroom practice or foundations of math, or your dyslexia delegates, they'll likely have some good content knowledge to support the implementation of this. Additionally, on the partnership agreement, you will notice that it requires you to list the names of individuals who will serve on the professional learning team. Having discussions with these individuals, sharing the responsibilities and the selection criteria, and gauging their commitment and capacity to engage in the work will be an important step in determining readiness. In addition to the responsibilities of your teams, we also want to share how the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction will support your work. How will we shorten the pathway, and how will we remove any of the barriers that sometimes impact change? As you can see, the responsibilities of DPI include first, to provide all of the online learning modules within a learning management system. And the learning management system that we'll be using is Canvas. You all across the state will all be able to access that content, whether you have an account with Canvas or not. The second is to provide a flexible structure for redelivery. We will talk about the flexibility that will be allowed within that structure in just a moment. Third, we will provide 5 face-to-face sessions in which we will share the content of the professional learning and engage in intentional technical assistance and coaching that is based on data that we're getting back from districts and schools. And finally, we will be providing ongoing technical assistance that just-in-time help when you all have a sudden implementation hurdle or barrier that you're facing. To further demarcate the implementation pathway, we provided an example timeline for engaging with DPI and supporting the professional learning at the district level. You can see that this timeline is broken down over the course of 2 years. In addition, any details that are on the left side of the timeline reflect direct work with the Department of Public Instruction, most of which will be occurring regionally. The details on the right side of the timeline reflect district-level implementation. We start with today's webinar, in which you are provided a framework and criteria for making an informed decision about your district or school's readiness. After contemplating these criteria, if you deem that you are indeed ready, a partnership agreement will be submitted to DPI by May 11th. We've gone over some of that partnership agreement thus far in the webinar, and we will continue to do so over the course of this webinar. Following from there, in August, we will hold the first regional face-to-face meetings, where the content of modules 1 and 2 will be made accessible to the professional learning teams. If you recall, at the beginning of the webinar, we linked to a different presentation that has all of the basic content of each module. So as you're going through this timeline later, if you want to go back and cross-reference each of these modules with the content, that module, that link at the beginning of this webinar will help you do so. Over the course of the fall of 2018, the professional learning team will continue to engage with the online learning materials in preparation for delivery of that content at the district level. In addition, during that time, they will engage with their first communication package from Module 1 with district level administrators. Following that, in December 2018, we will hold a second face-to-face meeting. The purpose of that will be to provide technical assistance and coaching on the content that they received and had been reviewing for Module 2. We will help prepare the teams for their subsequent delivery of that Module 2 content at the district level. And then we will release for the first time the Module 3 content. Over the winter of 2019, the professional learning team will then deliver locally the content of Module 2 to the selected schools who they deemed ready. They will also deliver the second communication package with district administrators. During that period of time, the team will also engage with the Module 3 content that was released at the previous face-to-face meeting, and doing so to prepare themselves to redeliver that content later. In April 2019, we will hold the third face-to-face meeting to provide technical assistance on the Module 3 content, help prepare teams for delivering the Module 3 content following that meeting. And then we will also release for the first time the Module 4 content. So what you have probably noticed and seen here is a pattern. This becomes a regular sequence of professional learning teams meeting regionally to receive content in a face-to-face session. During that time, they're preparing for delivery of the content virtually after they receive it. They then come back to receive technical assistance and coaching support in a subsequent face-to-face meeting with DPI staff. And then they deliver the content at the local level. Additionally, the administrator communication packages are aligned to this sequence so that the communication is aligned to the content that's being delivered over that particular period of time. This process will then continue through all of the modules and administrator communication packages, with the first cohort of local redelivery being completed in the winter of 2020. Let's go back to the elephant and the rider for a moment. What you just saw may not seem like the shortest path, and we know to engage in effective change, we have to do what we can do to meet your local needs and contexts. With that in mind, professional learning that changes not only teacher knowledge, skills, and behaviors, but also student outcomes is not easy, and there are no shortcuts. If we can't provide professional learning that's comprehensive, that happens within supportive and enabling context with job-embedded supports, it's not worth the implementation resources to begin with. With that said, why we can't profoundly change the length of the path, we can't shorten it that much, we can provide multiple paths for you to travel, all of which will lead to the same final destination. So we know that this work is going to be complex and that there are going to be implementation barriers that we have not yet considered or anticipated. And we know that the speed at which we progress through this implementation, that speed is not correlated with success. Instead, it's the quality in which we engage in all of these implementation activities. So with that in mind, the timeline that we just shared previously, it's one option. It's one that we've considered and thought might work for a number of districts and schools, and that they may choose to follow that. But we do want to share that is not one that you are indefinitely stuck with if your implementation data suggests a different pathway. So we'll go into what implementation flexibility might look like next. With that in mind, there are a list of implementation activities that we think should be accomplished during the 2018-19 school year for the purpose of continuing to foster readiness and the systems and the frameworks that will support implementation. So those activities include engaging in this readiness determination webinar. If you do deem that you're ready, submitting that partnership agreement by the due date on May 11th. To continue with some activities that will solidify the readiness and the responsibilities that are listed in the partnership agreement. So these are things like beginning to establish those communication feedback loops across your MTSS, district MTSS team and the professional learning team, developing roles and meeting structures for the professional learning team, and really building a rationale and those compelling whys for the first schools that you will be delivering this professional learning to. In addition to that, coming to the first professional learning team orientation, that first face-to-face meeting, which will be held regionally the week of August 6th, completing the Module 2 content following that first face-to-face meeting between August and December, going through that online professional learning and the virtual content, and then finally preparing for the Module 2 redelivery in that second regional face-to-face meeting, which will be held on the week of December 10th. Now we want to share where there will be some flexibility for local redelivery. You'll see that there are several options and then some potential customized pacing as well. So the first of those options would be to adhere to the suggested timeline or pacing guide that we've just shared. That timeline will exist. Those face-to-face meetings will exist. So you can always count on, if that's the time frame that you hope to accomplish these activities, and you find that you are accomplishing them with a high degree of fidelity, that timeline will remain available for you. The second option that we think could also be considered is to complete Module 1 and 2 within the first year and subsequently begin implementing that prior to being introduced to Modules 3, 4, and 5. So that would be during the 18 and 19 school year, focusing in on Modules 1 and 2, both of which really support the readiness and provide the foundational knowledge and skills to implement the subsequent modules. The third option would be to provide a customized pacing that could be negotiated as part of our readiness discussions in those 5 face-to-face meetings. So in order to make this work, we will continue to hold all of those face-to-face meetings that you saw on that timeline, and will continue regularly after those years. But we will engage in some systematic collection of information via our conversations and technical assistance and work with you, in addition to some more systematic survey level data, so that we can really design the content of each of those face-to-face meetings to flexibly meet the needs and the pace of implementation of different districts. So we know that we'll have to be creative in ensuring that we have breakout sessions and different opportunities to engage with districts that are at different places at each of those face-to-face meetings. So these are the first option 1 and option 2 we think could happen in a somewhat or in a rather standardized way. If you find that those options aren't working, we are happy to engage in some conversations based on data that you're collecting that determines the pace that you should engage in the activities to redeliver this content with a high level of fidelity. So going back to the elephant and rider analogy one more time, up to this point, we've described how we were going to ensure that we had a well-defined and clearly marked path. We described that maybe we can't substantially shorten the path, but we can provide multiple paths based on local contexts that eventually will take you to the same destination. So the third consideration is really motivation. And when we think about motivation, it's highly impacted by the beliefs and attitudes of our teachers. And what we know is, based on Thomas Guskey's work, that beliefs and attitudes don't change until teachers see a positive impact on their students. So this is a sequence of how beliefs and attitudes and subsequently motivation can be intentionally impacted. So it's the engagement of professional learning. Once teachers engage in that learning and they have the appropriate job-embedded supports that increase the likelihood and ease and fluency with which those practices can be delivered in the classroom setting, ultimately, following that, they would see changes in student outcomes. Once they see those changes, that's when beliefs and attitudes change. You reach a critical mass and you get people really motivated. The implications of this is we have to equip teachers with the effective practices that they will get some early wins and they'll see those changes in student progress. And we believe that that content is embedded within this professional learning. We're setting them up for success by ensuring that their administrators have a deep knowledge of the content that they are implementing, the types of things that will need to happen within the system at the district or school level to ensure that the right collaboration and supports are being provided to teachers, and then equipping them with the right skills to locate where students are and to effectively gauge and monitor their progress along validated learning progressions. Once that happens, we think, or we feel confident that teachers will see that their students are accelerating their learning and that this professional learning has had a positive impact on their ability to deliver specially designed instruction. Right, so we have talked about the challenges of the change process, the intentional steps that can be followed to make change less difficult. And now we want to think about how do we begin assessing our district's readiness to engage in this change. Some of the things that we're going to talk about over the rest of this webinar is defining readiness. That seems like it could be a little bit of a nebulous term. What do we mean when we say readiness? How do we know whether we are ready or we're not ready? Second is, why is it important? Is this something that we can successfully impact or change? And if we do impact or change it, does it lead to more successful implementation? And then if we are going to engage in this process of determining readiness, who should it be that's making that determination? So we're going to tackle all of these questions and really give you the why and the how to engage in this process. So now, let's take a few moments to explore the critical components of readiness and the composition of the team you should put together to make a determination of readiness. Having the right individuals at the table will be critically important to making a determination of readiness. This work will require a high level of collaboration and communication across a variety of stakeholders. We know the main factors of readiness, so those will be the factors that we explore over the course of this webinar. So we just had the opportunity to learn that readiness equals motivation times general capacity times intervention-specific capacity. We're going to talk in some detail what those terms mean in just a moment. However, it's important to start off with thinking, why is readiness important? Well, the first is it's an agreed upon factor that influences successful implementation. That is, systems and organizations that intentionally work to build readiness have a much higher likelihood of having successful implementation. And we know that readiness can be intentionally developed. Knowing the critical factors of readiness allow us to engage in some activities and steps to systematically build readiness for implementation. So now that we know the equation for readiness and the factors that comprise it, we can think about linking existing data sources to each one of those factors. Over the next few minutes, we'll describe how we can come together as a team to gauge our motivation for engaging and starting this work. We can gauge our general overall capacity and the systems and frameworks that we have in place that will act as systematic supports for implementation. And then we can also talk about the intervention-specific capacity that's specific to the services that we're providing to students with disabilities. We'll start with the factor of motivation. The first thing is to consider the stakeholders that will be leading this work and encouraging and inspiring others to push it forward. As a result of that, the individuals that you want to think about these guiding questions with could be your MTSS leadership team, your MTSS implementation team, the SDI within an MTSS professional learning team, if you've identified those members, and the schools targeted for implementation. Once we've identified our key stakeholders, there's a series of guiding questions that will help us assess the motivation of these stakeholders to complete the work. The first is understanding the why is critically important to motivation. Does this team understand why it's important to carefully consider and think about the implementation of specially designed instruction within a framework of a multi-tier system of support? A broader question might be, do we understand why we need to think about specially designed instruction as we're thinking about the broader district-wide efforts around school improvement? The second has to do with expectancy. We know that what we expect about the effort that we put in and the likelihood of having positive results is closely associated with motivation. So does this team believe, based on what they know of the implementation activities and the timelines and the supports that they have to complete those activities, do they believe that they can pull that off and that they can complete it with a high level of success? That expectancy will be important to drive motivation. A third, do they believe that all students within the school are general education students first? And as a result, we need to think about careful collaboration between general and special education teachers. And finally, is there a belief among the team and the schools that you'll be working in that we have a collective responsibility for all kids in the building, that we all feel responsible to every kid and that all kids are our kids? The next factor in the readiness equation is general capacity. General capacity consists of attributes of a well-functioning organization or system or framework. In this particular case, we are providing professional learning to impact classroom-level practices within the framework of a multi-tiered system of support. We know that if that framework is well established and healthy, and that the critical components of MTSS are being implemented well, that will greatly enhance and support the implementation of any evidence-based practices, in this case, the design and delivery of specially designed instruction. So in just a moment, we'll talk about some of the items of the SAM, the self-assessment of MTSS, that seem to be most relevant to this work, and that are an existing data source that you can pull to gauge your overall general capacity for the implementation of this professional learning. In addition to the general capacity our system or framework has for implementation, we also know that there are specific technical features and skills that support the implementation of a particular intervention. In this particular case, we are interested in those important components of comprehensive delivery of special education for students with disabilities. And those features really serve as the intervention-specific features that need to be in place to implement well. So we also have some existing data sources related to our comprehensive delivery of special education services within the district, and we will pull that from the LEA self-assessment and the improvement plan. So in just a moment, we'll talk about specific critical components of the LEA self-assessment we will examine in making a determination of readiness. So based on what we know about the primary factors of readiness and the existing tools and data sources that we have in place to analyze those factors, these are the readiness considerations that we would like for your team to review when making a determination of your overall readiness to begin engagement in this work. Again, these are not hard and fast requirements. As we said previously, we trust your team to make the best decision and be in the best position to be able to gauge your own readiness, but these are considerations for your team to use in the making of an informed decision. So the first of which is a majority of the district MTSS team members have completed modules 1, 2, and 3 of the MTSS online learning provided through Integrated Academic and Behavior Systems, that division. And also that team should include some representation from exceptional children department staff, so that we know that that team having a baseline level of understanding, knowledge, skills, dispositions will be important to begin this work. Second, at least 80% of the schools in the district are at a place of implementation that they are completing the North Carolina self-assessment of MTSS, or the SAM. So that's another consideration for readiness. In terms of district-wide implementation, do you have at least 80% of the schools at that place? The third is that the results of the self-assessment of MTSS indicate that the three-tiered instructional intervention model component of the SAM is at the level of initially implementing or fully implementing for 80% of the schools in the district. Or if using a cohort model of implementation where you have identified a group of schools as initial implementers, that those selected schools have met that criteria. So we know that if we will be implementing specially designed instruction within core, supplemental, and intensive supports for students, that three-tiered model has to be well established in order to do so. Fourth, we ask you to consider that the district has supporting evidence that validates the following levels of the SAM. First, at the intervention matrix developed at selected schools, that is indicative of a well-functioning standard treatment protocol. Second, that an assessment plan and data decision rules have been developed that reflect the content of the MTSS assessment guidelines and the MTSS data decision rules guidance. Third, that you have well-defined MTSS teaming structures that use an evidence-based problem-solving model. We've defined previously what those teams look like, what their composition is, and how they will support the professional learning team for this work. And then finally, that you have a defined core support plan so that you have a strong core that is functioning well for a majority of students. The next consideration is really around intervention-specific capacity, so looking at each of those core elements of the LEA self-assessment, those core elements that are, we know, important for the implementation of a comprehensive program of special education. So that implementation of at least 50% of those core elements as indicated by the practice profile summary on the LEA self-assessment. So those data are automatically generated for you on the LEA self-assessment on that practice profile summary tab. Next is that you have the capacity to develop and sustain that district professional learning team. Again, we've described who that team is and what the selection criteria for that team is, and that you feel confident that that team has the requisite resources and capacity to fulfill the responsibilities of the partnership agreement. And then finally, just ensuring that your LEA is willing and able to collaborate with the state education agency, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, to consistently collaborate within the framework that we've described to support implementation. So now that we've described the readiness considerations and the data sources that will be used to consider each of those items, these are the details of how to submit if your team deems that you are ready to begin in this work. That you have the motivation, the general capacity, and the intervention-specific capacity to do this well at this point in time. So the directions for submission is after your team carefully consider each of those baseline considerations to download the partnership agreement. You've seen the link to that already within this presentation, and to complete each of the components of that. We've walked through each of the components during this webinar. At that point in time, you will email the completed document in its electronic form to ginger.cash@dpi.nc.gov. In addition to that, we ask that you print a hard copy of that final page that has the required signatures, and you mail those wet signatures to Ginger Cash as well at the Exceptional Children's Division at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, 6356 Mail Service Center, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27699. So you will be submitting that partnership agreement both electronically via email with the completed document and then a hard copy of the signatures. So that brings us to an opportunity to answer questions, and we will open up the webinar now for questions. If you are live on the webinar on March 16th, please unmute and you can ask a question, or if you would rather ask the question via the chat feature, you can do so as well. If you are watching an archived version of this, you can email questions to Lynn Lozer at dpi.nc.gov or Lauren Holohan at laurenholohan@dpi.nc.gov. Thank you for your time, your commitment to this work. We look forward to all of our opportunities ahead of us to engage in this important work together.